What makes a man with a dream of fame choose violence, deception, and ultimately murder? The crowd roared. Bright lights beamed down on the wrestling ring as Johnny K9 raised his fists in the air, sweat dripping from his brow. A smug grin spread across his face. Inside the ropes, he was the villain everyone loved to hate, a brute, a bully, a force of chaos. But outside the ring, the mask didn't come off. It only grew heavier. He wasn't just playing the bad guy, he was one. In the shadowed corners of Hamilton, Ontario, his name was whispered in fear. He wasn't just throwing punches in a staged brawl, he was breaking bones in the basement of a crime lord's home. He wasn't just a wrestler, he was an enforcer, a biker, a man with blood-stained hands. And then came the explosion. A bomb ripped through the walls of a police station, shaking the city to its core. A crime so reckless, so brazen, that law enforcement had no choice but to act. But when they followed the trail of destruction, they didn't find a mastermind. They found a man who had spent his entire life fighting, both in the ring and in the streets, only to lose it all in the end. What happens when a man who craves power realizes he will never have enough? When the spotlight fades and the only way to stay relevant is through violence. This is the story of Johnny K9, the wrestler who traded the roar of the crowd for the silence of a prison cell, the man who lived by his own rules, until his time ran out. Welcome to True Crime Theatre HQ. For more stories like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next crime story. And if you found this as gripping as we did, share it with your friends. You never know who else might be listening. Ion William Croitoru never had the luxury of a peaceful childhood. His home wasn't a place of comfort. It was a battlefield. His father's rage filled every corner. His mother's cries were background noise, and the bruises left behind were the only proof that last night had been just as bad as the one before. For some, an upbringing like this breaks them. For Johnny K9, it built him. Pain became fuel. Fear turned into defiance. And the world? It was a place where you either got hit or you hit first. By the time he was a teenager, he had one thing on his mind: getting bigger, getting stronger, and making sure that no one could ever push him around again. The gym became his second home, the weights a distraction from everything else. He chased muscle, power, and presence, carving himself into a figure that demanded attention. But brute strength wasn't enough. He wanted to be somebody. Wrestling offered him that chance. The ring was a world where the biggest, loudest, and most aggressive men were worshipped. He fought under different names, stepping into the scripted violence of professional wrestling with the same hunger he carried his entire life. He wasn't graceful, he wasn't the most skilled, but he knew how to make an impact. And if that meant playing the villain, so be it. But there was one problem. In wrestling, wins and losses weren't earned. They were assigned. And Johnny K9 was never the chosen one. While other wrestlers climbed the ranks, he remained in the shadows. A jobber, paid to lose, paid to make the stars look good. He could take the punches, but he couldn't take the reality. No matter how much he fought, no matter how brutal he was in the ring, he wasn't the one the crowds came to see. And Johnny K9 didn't take losing well. The thrill of performance started to wear off. The bright lights of the wrestling world dimmed, and in the background, a different opportunity was waiting. One that didn't require playing by someone else's script. One that rewarded brutality, intimidation, and strength. Hamilton had its own set of kings, not wrestlers, not athletes, but men who ruled with fear. And Johnny K9 was exactly the kind of soldier they were looking for. The Gruel crime family had a reputation. They weren't the biggest name in the underworld, but they were ruthless. They ran drugs, they settled debts, and when someone needed to be reminded of what was owed, they didn't ask twice. Johnny K9 wasn't just welcomed into their world, he was built for it. He didn't just collect money. He made sure people felt what it meant to cross the wrong men. His hands, once used to fake fights for a roaring crowd, became tools of something far more real. The stories spread quickly. A man beaten so badly his own mother wouldn't recognize him. Another found unconscious, blood smeared across the walls. This wasn't wrestling. There was no bell to signal the end. And Johnny K9 was finally getting the respect he thought he deserved. His life was changing. No more scripted losses. No more waiting for his chance. In this world, respect was earned in bruises, broken bones, and silence. He liked it. He embraced it. But what he didn't know was that the choices he was making, the ones that made him feel powerful, unstoppable, were leading him somewhere he wouldn't be able to fight his way out of. Because once you start working for men like the Gruels, there's no walking away. And Johnny K9 was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Power is intoxicating. For Johnny K9, the taste of it had become an addiction. The bruises, the blood, the fear in a man's eyes just before he begged for mercy. It was all proof that he had climbed higher than most men ever would. The wrestling world had given him a glimpse of fame, but it was in the streets that he became a name worth remembering. The Gruel crime family had given him a place to prove himself, but even they had their limits. Their power was business, their influence was money. That wasn't enough for Johnny. He wanted something more. Something where power didn't come from negotiations or influence, it came from force. That's when Satan's choice came calling. Outlaw biker gangs weren't just criminals. They were a society within a society. A brotherhood bound not by blood, but by violence and loyalty. They didn't answer to anyone. They took what they wanted, did what they pleased, and no one, not the police, not the government, not rival gangs, could tell them otherwise. Johnny K9 fit in perfectly. His reputation preceded him. The beatings, the intimidation, the way he carried himself like nothing in the world could touch him. It wasn't long before he climbed the ranks, and when the Hamilton chapter of Satan's Choice needed a new leader, there was only one real candidate. Johnny K9 was now a president. He ran the city like a king. Businesses paid for his protection, and those who refused soon learned that money wasn't the worst thing they could lose. He walked into bars, and people looked away. He rode through the streets, and no one dared to cross him. And for Johnny, that respect, the kind that wasn't handed out, but taken, was more valuable than anything wrestling had ever given him. But power is a dangerous thing. When you have too much of it, you start thinking you can do anything. And when you believe you can do anything, you start making mistakes. Johnny K9 made the biggest mistake of his life in 1996. It started with something trivial, something that shouldn't have mattered to a man at the top. A strip club called Solid Gold. A simple rule: no biker gang colors inside. It wasn't personal, it was policy. A rule meant to keep the peace. But men like Johnny K9 didn't follow rules, they made them. When he and Michael Dubé, another high-ranking member of Satan's Choice, were turned away at the door, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult, a challenge. In their world, being disrespected was the same as being weakened, and weakness wasn't an option. They wanted revenge, not a fight, not a threat, something bigger, something that would send a message, a bomb. The plan was reckless, but that was never a concern. Johnny K9 had a man who could build it, a former soldier, someone who knew how to make things disappear. The target was clear: solid gold. A reminder that no one told Satan's Choice what to do. That was the plan. But Dubé had his own ideas. Johnny K9 may have been feared, but Dubé was something else entirely. A man who didn't just thrive on violence, but lived for it. Someone who believed the only real power came from destruction. Instead of placing the bomb at the strip club, he made a last-minute change. He set it against the walls of the Sudbury police station. The explosion shattered windows, tore through brick and concrete, and sent a shockwave through the entire city. Officers inside barely had time to react before debris rained down on them. In an instant, a strip club dispute had turned into an act of war against law enforcement. Johnny K9 had no idea. Not until the phone rang. Not until he heard the words that made his stomach drop. "What do you mean, the police station? It was supposed to be solid gold." Panic set in. There was no walking this back, no explaining it away. He had been reckless before, but this was different. This was something that couldn't be ignored, something that wouldn't be forgiven. The police had been watching Satan's choice for a long time. And now? Now they had everything they needed to take him down. Because Johnny K9 didn't just make a mistake, he had declared war. And the people coming for him weren't the kind you could intimidate. They were the kind who didn't stop until you were in a cage or in the ground. The first mistake was getting caught. The second mistake was thinking there would be a way out. The raid came fast. SWAT teams, flashbangs, shouts of authority cutting through the night. It wasn't just another bust. It was a full-scale takedown. The clubhouse doors were blown off their hinges, members of Satan's choice dragged out one by one, forced onto the pavement, hands zip-tied behind their backs. This wasn't a warning. This was the end of the line. And right in the middle of it, Johnny K9. For years, he had been untouchable. Fear had always been his shield. But now, it was the police who weren't afraid. They had been waiting for the right moment, and the moment had finally arrived. He was no longer the one making the rules. Behind bars, the weight of his choices came crashing down. His name had meant something out there. Power, respect, authority. But in here, none of that mattered. In here, he was just another criminal, and even worse, one with a target on his back. Because while the police had taken him in, his real enemies weren't wearing badges. They were the men he had once called brothers. The rules in the outlaw world were simple. You don't talk. You don't make deals. And if you do, you pay the price. Rumors spread fast, whispers that Johnny K9 had said too much, that he had given names, information. It didn't matter if it was true or not. Once the doubt was there, once the wrong people started believing it, the outcome was inevitable. The beatings started early. Prison wasn't just a sentence, it was a warning. Bruises turned to broken bones. By the time he got out, he was no longer feared. He was an outcast, stripped of his power, a dead man walking, and someone had already made sure of that. One night, a knock at his door. A familiar voice, one that should have sent him running, but instead it froze him in place. "John, I was sent to kill you, but I won't." A hit had been placed on his life. The kind of hit you don't escape. But the man sent to carry it out. He was an old friend, and old friends, even in the ugliest corners of the world, sometimes still held on to something resembling loyalty. The message was clear. Leave now, or next time there wouldn't be a choice. And so, he ran. Vancouver was meant to be a fresh start, a place to disappear, a place where Johnny K9 could become someone else. He found Tracy again, the woman who had once believed in him, who had once seen more than just the violence and the chaos. For a while, it almost seemed like things could be different, but men like Johnny K9 don't change. Not really. It wasn't long before the pull of his old life became too strong to resist. The same hunger, the same need for power, the same urge to prove that he was still the man he had always been. The only problem? The world had moved on without him. The power he once had was gone. The reputation he once held had crumbled. And the people he was about to align himself with were far more dangerous than anyone he had ever known before. Johnny K9 was walking straight into his final chapter, and this time there would be no second chances. By 2008, Johnny K9 wasn't the same man who once ruled Hamilton's streets. The years had caught up to him, the prison stints, the betrayals, the constant chase for power that never seemed to last. He was older now, heavier, slower. But in his mind, he was still the man he had always been. A man who could walk into any room and command respect. A man who could make people fear him. But fear fades. And when it does, the only thing left is desperation. Vancouver was supposed to be his second chance. Instead, it became the last stop before the inevitable. His connection to Satan's choice was gone, but he had found a new home, a new gang, a new war, the United Nations gang, a name that sounded almost respectable, but behind closed doors, they were just as ruthless as any outlaw club he had ever known. And with them, Johnny K9 was no longer just a fading relic of the past. He was useful again. He became part of their war against the Red Scorpions, a rival gang with a reputation for violence that matched their own. The orders were clear: take them out. And Johnny K9? He was all too happy to prove he still had a place in this world. But then came the mistake, the one that couldn't be undone. It was supposed to be a message, a targeted hit. One less Red Scorpion walking the streets. But instead, it was Jonathan Barber. A young man with no ties to the gang world. A car technician, just a guy doing his job, picking up a vehicle to bring it back to the shop. A black Porsche Cayenne, unfortunately the same model driven by Jonathan Bacon, one of the Red Scorpion's most wanted men. Johnny K9 and his crew didn't wait for confirmation. They didn't check twice. The bullets rained down, shredding the car, ripping through the body inside. And by the time they realized the truth, it was too late. There was no way out of this one. No lies that could cover it up. No violence that could erase the fact that an innocent man had just been murdered in the middle of a war he wasn't even part of. And when the arrests came, Johnny K9 knew there was no fight left to give. The courtroom was nothing new to him. Neither were the charges. But this time, something was different. The man who had once taken beatings in the ring and walked away with a grin now sat in a courtroom, worn down, exhausted. His body was breaking apart, his name no longer carried weight, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't feared. He was just another aging criminal in front of a judge. 13 years. That was the sentence. A lifetime of violence, of destruction. And this was how it ended, locked away, waiting out the years. But prison wasn't the same this time. The years of fighting had worn him down. The muscle had turned to weight. The invincible exterior was cracking. And before he could serve the full sentence, he was let out early. But freedom didn't mean redemption. By 2017, Johnny K9 was a ghost of his former self. The reputation was gone, the gang ties severed. He was placed in a halfway house, the only place that would take him. No club, no allies, no power. Just an aging man waiting for whatever came next. And then, one morning, it was over. Dead at 53. Official cause? A heart attack. But in the world Johnny K9 came from, nothing was ever that simple. Some say it was the years of steroids, the years of abuse his body had taken. Others whisper about something else, that maybe, just maybe, the past had finally caught up with him. That one of the many enemies he had made along the way had decided to close the final chapter for him. The truth? It was buried with him. And just like that, Johnny K9, the wrestler, the enforcer, the outlaw, the man who spent his entire life fighting, was finally out of time. Johnny K9 spent his life chasing something: respect, power, fear, maybe even redemption. But in the end, all he left behind was a trail of destruction. He wanted to be a name people never forgot. And in a way, he got his wish. But not as the wrestling star he once dreamed of being. Not as the feared outlaw biker who ruled Hamilton's underworld. Instead, he became something else entirely. A cautionary tale. A man who fought for control, only to lose everything. His life was a series of battles. The ones in the ring, where the outcomes were scripted. The ones in the streets, where respect came at the cost of blood. The ones in courtrooms, where he faced charges that should have ended him long before his body ever gave out. But the most important battles, they were the ones he never won. The victims remain. Lynn and Fred Gilbank, slain in their own home, their murders still surrounded by unanswered questions. Jonathan Barber, gunned down for nothing more than driving the wrong car at the wrong time. The countless others, beaten, extorted, terrorized in the name of power. For all the chaos he unleashed, for all the people he hurt, there's one undeniable truth. Johnny K9 didn't die a legend. He didn't go down as a hero. He wasn't feared in the end. He was forgotten. Another man in a halfway house, another name on an autopsy report, another life wasted on the wrong choices. Justice isn't about how you start. It's about how you finish. And Johnny K9, he finished exactly the way he lived. Alone, surrounded by the consequences of a life spent on the wrong side of the line. Remember, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. See you in the next case.